which is the worst single decision in history ever made by a person. Mao Zedong pest campaign. He basically told his nation to take pots and pans to kill all the sparrows. However, the ecosystem was disturbed and the locust population skyrocketed. Seeds. He thought that planting seeds 1 meter in the ground would result in greater roots and better harvest. He also thought that putting tons of seeds in one compact area would cause a better harvest. All the seeds died, however. Around 30 million or so died from famine under his rule. Hey, look at the other nations industrializing. Let's smelt all our metal to build better infrastructure. What? It creates pig iron, which is super unstable and impure, therefore being ultimately useless? Oops, Mao. The decision by the Scottish to invade England during Black Death must be up there. Now You See Me sequel not being called Now You Don't. Eastman Kodak deciding not to go forward with their own newly invented digital cameras and instead sticking with film because it made them so much money at the time. Isn't the real shoot decision that the guy who invented the digital camera in 1975 at Kodak wanted to let Kodak patent it, and they said nah, who's going to get into these things. I got married in 1990. I remember our wedding photographer explaining the direction of photography and the coming extinction of film. I figured he must be crazy, and I doubled my investments in desktop calculators instead. Hong Xiuquan declared the Taiping Rebellion after he had a nervous breakdown from failing the imperial examinations. He proclaimed that he was the brother of Jesus Christ. 30 million people died. My great-great-grandfather, a carpenter, did some work for a poor painter in the neighborhood. The painter had no money, so he offered either a bottle of wine or a painting. My great-great-grandfather chose the wine. The painter was Edvard Munch, and the painting would have been worth millions upon millions today, or even just a few decades later, if translated to today's money. Edit replied to the first guy who pointed it out. True. Doesn't really qualify. I guess what makes a decision really bad is when you should be able to see the consequences. Maybe the worst business decision ever made was by Xerox with their Alto computer. Xerox invented the graphical interface modern computers use. Desktop, folders, copy/paste, etc. They basically invented the modern computer in the 70s. But the problem was, the people in charge at the time were businessmen without any technical knowledge, so they didn't realize what they had. They did nothing with it, and gave it away to universities, and showed other companies. The famous story is that Steve Jobs saw this, and within 5 minutes realized this was the way computers would work in the future. He copied it, because Xerox didn't patent their invention and didn't do anything with it, and the rest is history. Xerox could have been Apple or Microsoft. Or both. They could have had a monopoly on the entire PC industry. Almost every company uses Windows in their offices. I think 80 or 90% of consumers uses Windows. That could have been Xerox. They had the tech maybe 10 years before anyone else. They could have been the most valuable company of all time, but they just gave it away. Robert Ballard, one of the guys who discovered Titanic, says that his biggest regret is that he and Jane Laus Michelle didn't bring a piece of the Titanic up with him when he first discovered it in 1985. At the time, they didn't want to disturb the wreck and leave it pristine. But if they had done so, then they would have been able to claim legal ownership of the wreck under international maritime law, and therefore more control over it. Because they chose not to do that, everyone and their grandma is free to take artifacts and pieces of the wreck, and this makes preservation impossible. Edit. A fair number of people have been asking this in the comments, so instead of replying to everyone individually, I thought I'd put this in as an edit. And thanks to the commenters who helped explain this, there is a school of thought which Robert Ballard and myself incidentally subscribes to, which is that the wreck is the final resting place of the more than 1,500 souls who perished that cold night on the 14th of April 1912, and must therefore be treated with the same respect and dignity. Private companies who take artifacts and pieces of the wreck and sell them for profit are effectively grave robbing. And while the wreck is gradually deteriorating into nothing, the argument is that this doesn't matter, it's just nature taking its course. Of course, there is the argument that removing certain artifacts from the wreck and putting them in a museum is conducive to both the public good and the memory of the victims. I don't have a problem with that. personally, and I can't speak for Robert Bullard, but I do have a problem with the commercial scavengers taking pieces up to sell them. My understanding is that if he and his team were the registered owners of the wreck, he would have a claim to anything taken from the wreck and sold for profit, which would potentially deter people. Not the worst in the world, but apparently my family owned a little town west of Kent, UK. My great-great-great-grandfather got plastered one night and gambled it all away. That one time Nintendo had a partnership with Sony to develop a CD-based console, but in the end changed their mind and kicked Sony out cause they decided to stick with cartridges. Sony then thought, screw this, we'll make our own console with blackjack and hookers, and created the PlayStation as a frick you towards Nintendo. Alcibiades was considered a traitor in Athens for leading his men to death. A traitor in Sparta because he got the queen to cheat on the king with him, and a traitor in Persia after including them in a war edit. So I did a little bit of info, and the switching sides and stealing statues decks are also true, plus he is a bisexual. Not like there is anything wrong with bisexuality. Alright gentlemen, we've successfully fended off the Greeks for 10 years. Our great city of Troy still stands. If we keep this up, surely they will realize the siege is fruitless and return home before long. Yo captain, there's this big ass wooden horse outside, oh rad, bring it in. To be fair to the Trojans, there wasn't all that much they could do, because the gods had essentially made up their minds. Laocoon was like, hey, this is a bad idea, and then got eaten by a giant water monster. The Trojans kind of took that as a sign that the gods clearly wanted them to bring the horse in. Plus Cassandra protested, but you know, cursed by Apollo and all that. And the Trojans were probably fricked regardless, since Hector was dead and Achilles was back in the fighting and extra mad because Patroclus was dead. The horse was just the death blow. Edit. Sorry, I got the timeline mixed up. Achilles was already dead at this point. Still, without Hector the Trojans really didn't have much of a chance, especially since the Greeks had formidable soldiers who weren't Achilles, Agamemnon, Menelaus, etc. The Donner Party of 90 pioneers choosing to take a shortcut when heading west from Illinois to California in 1846. Said shortcut led to them getting trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains and resorting to cannibalism. Thomas Midgley Jr. can lay claim to 3. First, he discovered and helped popularize the use of lead in petrol/gasoline, causing unimaginable harm to the atmosphere and our brains. He contracted lead poisoning when working on the project, but apparently neglected to draw any conclusions from this. Second, he led the team that discovered freon, the first chlorofluorocarbon, and helped popularize the use of CFCs in refrigeration and industrial applications, causing further unimaginable harm to the atmosphere. It's suggested that he had a greater impact on the atmosphere than any other single person in history. As for the third, well, straight from Wikipedia, in 1940, at the age of 51, Midgley contracted poliomyelitis, which left him severely disabled. He devised an elaborate system of ropes and pulleys to lift himself out of bed. In 1944, he became entangled in the device and died of strangulation. Brutus decided to join Cassius in murdering the dictatorial tyrant, Caesar. The reason? They suspected his intent to become a king, which then started a chain of events leading to his adopted son Caesar becoming a military dictator without equal, having all the powers of a king without being called one. When this Caesar Augustus dies, his name and title is passed on for the next 400 years, almost like you would a crown. Monarch is then returned all over Europe, in the style of Augustus Caesar. And so, the decision of Brutus to join the conspiracy in effect changed all of Western civilization for the next 1900 years, to adopt the very political style he wanted to avoid. It would not be until the 1770s when America and later France would begin revolting and experimenting with democracies and republics. Mao Zedong's revolutionary campaign, the Great Leap Forward, resulting in millions of people starving to death. Whoever said the world's biggest MMO RuneScape should remove the wilderness and free trade? They threw a literal fortune down the drain, just because they didn't understand their own product. Nokia, yes, this phone will kill you boys, developed first smartphone way before Apple, but did not believe them to be the future. They just continued developing the old style phones. Anatoly Dyatlov making sure with every step that reactor 4 at Chernobyl exploded in 1986. Stealing John Wick's car and killing his dog. 299 total kills and counting. Yahoo refused to buy Google for 1 million and later for 40 billion again. Edit. They refused 1 million, later offered 3B and Google wanted 5B, so no deal, and Yahoo was offered 40B by Microsoft and they didn't want to sell, and later they sold for 6B. 8 years ago when that guy bought 2 large pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin. Me, when, against my better judgment, I opened a kennel to let 2 angry pit bulls out. Their owner said, "Just let them out. They won't hurt you." Next thing I remember is being flown in a medical helicopter to the hospital, where I spent over 2 months and had 18 surgeries to repair the damage those dogs did. Yep. Worst single decision in history, for sure. Sultan Murad IV sending the first flying man in history, Hazarfen Amd Salibi, flying 3 kilometers over the Bosporus in 1638 into exile instead of putting all efforts into aviation. Henry Tandy, who supposedly spared /Zero Adolf Hitler's life during the war. The story is set on the 28th of September 1918, while Tandy was serving with the 5th Duke of Wellington's regiment, and relates that a weary German soldier wandered into Tandy's line of fire. The enemy soldier was wounded and did not even attempt to raise his own rifle. Tandy chose not to shoot. The German soldier saw him lower his rifle and nodded his thanks before wandering off. That soldier is purported to have been Adolf Hitler. Gavrilo Princip shooting Archduke Franz Ferdinand. On that day, a man acted upon his self-constructed vendetta against an tyrannical monarch, thinking the world would remember him as a symbol against foreign tyranny, a symbol of national sovereignty. A year later, 10 million men were dead. The development of nuclear weapons was probably inevitable, and several situations arose that balanced Armageddon on a knife edge. Many historical decisions could have tipped the balance via butterfly effect, so I take these questions in that light. All those terrible decisions, luckily, led to us to still be around to make a few more.